Welcome to Spiritual Naturalism Today, a conversation on science, nature, and spirituality. Our program is sponsored by the Spiritual Naturalist Society with host Daniel Strain.
Hello, and thank you for listening. I'm Daniel Strain, and I'm joined by my co-host here, Jay Forrest.
Hello.
And hello, Jay.
How you doing?
Good. I've been well. I'm glad you're on the program with us here today. Today we're going to be talking about Stoicism, and that is a philosophy that I am very partial to. I talk about it a lot. I've probably mentioned it way too much in previous episodes, and it's helped me a lot in my life. I know a lot of other people that it's helped. And Jay, I believe you are just starting to get into it and have read a few things already, right?
Yes, I've started. Actually, it was through you that I really got interested in Stoicism. Of course, my background and specialty is in Buddhism, and finding out that there's a lot in Stoicism that's similar to Buddhism kind of got me curious. And they actually have some different perspectives and practices than Buddhism does. So I'm expanding my understanding of those things. So.
Yeah, I think that's great. Today we can talk about various elements of it for people, and I can answer some misconceptions about it. And
I think that's probably the biggest thing, because I took, when I was in college and doing the university stuff, there was courses on philosophy, and it was really really briefly they touched on Stoicism, and you got the impression that the Stoics were a bunch of upper lip, stiff, unemotional, almost like, it kind of reminded me, my impression was I kind of got the impression that they were like Vulcans, they were all logical, and they really didn't have any emotion and stuff like that. And that's why I think one of the, you hear people saying, well, you're being very stoic about it. Very unemotional is the impression. And as you begin studying Stoicism, you find out, well, that's a misunderstanding.
Yeah, absolutely. The way we use the word Stoic today in common usage is kind of an exaggeration or whatever you call it that's happened over the course of history in the evolution of the way we use that word in language, but it's not very informative about the Stoics. They weren't like Vulcans. I should say this at the outset because this is a common response. It is quite unhealthy for a person to suppress their emotions or to ignore them or to try to suppress them or anything like that. As Buddhism teaches us, we want to be mindful of what's going on inside of our own minds. And as we have these emotions, we need to face them fully, accept them, acknowledge that they're there. Any kind of pretending like that is going to lead you down the wrong road, and that's certainly not what Stoicism advocates. The reason Stoicism got that reputation, though, is because to an outside observer, it might seem like a Stoic is maybe less wild with their emotions, maybe more even-keeled. I've often been told that I'm even-keeled. And it doesn't mean that you don't have joy in your life, you don't have happiness, you don't laugh, you don't, experience all the healthy emotions. But if you look at translations of Stoic writings, you won't find something that translates very well into the word emotion as we use it today. It's kind of all-encompassing. They did talk about feelings and impulses, but what they talk about is the thing that Stoicism is designed to deal with are the passions, and even that is a poor translation because we often think of passion as a good thing. Oh, you got to have passion in life. And in that definition, that is a good thing. But what they meant by it was something more like pathos. I like to use the word pathos. I don't often use overly technical or obscure words, but sometimes with these bad translations, it's better to have a word like that than to have something that's misleading.
Right.
So pathos, as you might have guessed, is derived from pathology, same root word as pathology. It's sickness of the soul, so to speak. And that's the emotions that come about because of false understandings, and that they also have the attribute that they are unhealthy for us, unhelpful. And they can be positive or negative. They'd
be negative. They could be positive, but have a negative consequence, is what you're saying.
That's what I mean. Yeah. I mean, it's not necessarily just anger and greed and all that kind of thing. You could actually have a negative version of something that seems to feel good to you, but it's like more charity. Like a drug in the way it's acting.
Or even, the impulse to give, for example, to be charitable. We'd think that would be a good thing, but sometimes that can end up enabling somebody, giving them money when you know that they're going to turn around and spend that on drugs or whatever. That might be.
Yeah, or a good example might be relishing so much of something that you forget that this is just a mere entertainment, and it's not really what's important to happiness in life. And then when it's gone, you're just distraught because you were so enamored and overtaken with it, you forgot the truth. And that's the false judgment that led to that particular pathos.
Okay, so would that almost like the Buddhist idea of attachment?
Mm-hmm. Very similar.
In
fact, the similarities. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Where you grab on and you cling to something, you actually end up destroying that something you cling to.
Yeah, the similarities between Stoicism and Buddhism are so great that it's led many people to think that there's a thing called Greco Buddhism, where there's kind of this. There was some trade that went on, the Silk Road or whatever, between that area and China, and there very well could have been some cross.
Well, it wasn't this about the time that Alexander was going into India?
Yes, and some influences were coming back the other way too.
Yeah.
So, regardless of what that is, I prefer to focus on the ideas as they are today and how they can be helpful to us. Although it's a fascinating historic issue too. But the areas are so similar. I've been studying for about 10 years. I've been studying the overlap between Buddhism and Stoicism, and I've got charts. I mentioned to Jade before we started recording today my book of mad ravings, and I've got all kinds of notes and charts and things about what concepts. You have to get past the words because the words don't match up perfectly. There are different translations for different areas of the world, and but once you get past that and you get to the core of the concepts, which concepts are really consistent and overlap, and where do they not? And what it seems like to me is that there's this path that's a very helpful path, a helpful kind of practice, and Buddhism puts its road markers along the path at different places than Stoicism does. But it's outlining the same path. It's just it highlights different aspects of that path in different ways. Because of that, what you end up with is that, and this is why I practice kind of a meshing of the two. I've found that, for example, the Stoics talk about non-attachment, but I've found that Stoicism provides some perspectives and practices that really help me get there mentally. Meanwhile, Buddhism has I don't know if you'd say perfected, but Buddhism has far exceeded Stoicism in its analysis of the human mind and the practice of meditation, and the use of that for achieving the kind of mindfulness that Stoics sought. Likewise, another thing that I think Buddhism excels at is in the area of compassion. Stoics talked about brotherly love and being a citizen of the cosmos or cosmopolitanism.
Right.
But it was more of an ideal, whereas Buddhism gets to the nitty-gritty and really helps us get there in our deep responses. So they each have their strengths, and they really, to me, complement one another.
Well, my question for you is, as I, of course, being a student of both, you will understand this, but the thing is, like, if you read Marcus Aurelius, which is one of the Stoics, was an emperor of Rome, he talked about God a lot, and you kind of get the feeling that God is part of the Stoics, where God is not part of Buddhism, as far as the practice. Yes, if you read the Pali Canon, there's gods and stuff, but they're pretty much stuck in the same situation we are. In Buddhism, they're part of samsara, the round of suffering, where in Stoicism, you get kind of an idea of a God who's above the mess, and yet sometimes I hear people talk about it being more of a pantheism.
Yeah, that's a very fascinating subject, and I'm glad you went there, because the very next thing I was thinking is that when I say they overlap, really they overlap in one particular area of each of their spectrums. Okay. So there's a spectrum of Buddhism that ranges from the naturalistic over to, I got to put things outside my house to feed the hungry ghosts, and stuff, which we would consider not really a part of core Buddhism. But nevertheless, many, many, many people practice Buddhism in all these different forms. And likewise with Stoicism, if you look at different Stoic authors, they speak in different, even the ancient philosophers, they speak in different ways about Zeus. The early Stoics were criticized as being atheists. They were called theists in name only. Okay. And it's because of these ways that they talked about Zeus. So really you have both of these things happening you have the more Spinozan kind of deity. Of course, that way predates Spinoza, but you have that kind of approach, and then you have the more literal approach.
Now, is that more with the Greek Stoics than the Roman Stoics? Because I know within Greek thought, Herculitus, for example, was very much a pantheist and very close in some ideas to the idea of Spinoza and the idea of nature and God being...
Yeah. And of course,
whereas Romans also follow that same. I mean, in the Stoic, because of course we haven't really said this, but Stoicism, really, there's Greek Stoics and Roman Stoics, and the Roman Stoics seems like they're more practical, where the Greeks are more philosophical. At least that's my first impression of reading them.
I don't know. Maybe I would think that there's both in both. Epictetus was an early one, and he's one of my favorites, and he tends to be the ethical, philosophical side. Seneca gets really down to dealing with life's hardships and things like that.
And Zeno was really considered the founder, right?
Yes. The school was founded by Zeno, Zeno of Citium.
Yeah, just giving kind of giving a little bit of a historical, so we can... where we hang things, just to give people a little bit of a framework, because, for example, Stoicism, you think, well, who was Mr. Stoa? Because Buddhism.
Let me tell that story. It's really fascinating.
It is, actually.
Okay, so there's a book I'm going to reference here. It's a kind of a chronology, and so about 300 BCE, Zeno of Citium begins teaching, and Zeno has an interesting history in his own right, but we don't have time to go into every detail. But Zeno starts teaching Stoicism around 300 BCE, and the place that he goes to teach it is in the Agora. Now, the interesting thing about this is that you've got a guy here teaching the virtues of, let's just say his teachings were very much against the materialism that you might see a lot of in the market. It'd be almost like as if you went to teach minimalism in the middle of a shopping mall. Mm-hmm. And so that was very interesting in its own right. But then And his first followers that started gathering around him and hearing his teachings were called Zenonites. That was the original name. And but they would always gather under the stoa, and the stoa is their word for like a painted roof, a roof structure.
Or painted porch is what I've heard.
Painted porch, yeah, I'm sorry. A porch, and it had a roof. Yeah. And so it means porch, basically. Stoicism means porchism, because these people would hang out on the porch. And so that's kind of a funny origin for the name there, but that's where it came from. Anyway, he founded his school in 300 BC, and that school passed on to Chrysippus and Diogenes and a whole bunch of other people. And eventually we get up to Epictetus is a big figure, as I mentioned before. Seneca was much later, and then much after that was Marcus Aurelius. And I find it very interesting that Epictetus had been a slave and Marcus Aurelius was an emperor. So you've got the full spectrum there of honored contributors to
Stoicism. So Stoicism wasn't for the elite, which we find sometimes. Philosophical Taoism, for an example, tends to be more among the elite, and religious Taoism more among the commoners.
Yeah, in fact, the Stoics were some of the earliest people to have no differences between the males and females as far as who could be a Stoic, who could be a sage, who could excel in the philosophy.
Yeah, Confucius didn't have a very good idea of women, so.
Who?
Confucius.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So yeah, it was kind of a conservative, as we would call it today, philosophy, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, I'm just kind of comparing the differences between the different schools, because Buddhism, of course, was one of the first ones to actually ordain women. Taoism being almost the feminine of Confucianism, Taoism ended up emphasizing the feminine, where Confucius, it was more about the males and male-dominated society at the time. So
and
it's
all
kind
of those have had a wonderful influence on one another, I think, for the better.
Yeah. Well, I think if you actually, and I've had a few friends who were from China. One was from Hong Kong, but pretty much Chinese culture. And he said that really, if you go to China, people aren't Confucius or Taoist. They don't divide up that way. They just pick whatever they need in their lives. If we need a ritual, we either turn to Buddhism or Taoism, whatever happens to be the most effective of the rituals. And they don't look at it as I belong to Buddhism. They look at it more as Buddhism belongs to them. It's just one of the things they use. It's kind of an interesting perspective. We in the West, we actually identify, I'm a Christian, I'm a Buddhist. Where in China, I'm Chinese and I do this Buddhist thing and I do this, where here it's like, can't you make up your mind? Are you humanist? Are you what? We want we want
it's
it.
like nobody would say, oh, you do yoga, you're a yogist.
Yeah.
No, I just
exactly.
do yoga. Yeah.
Or a Tai Chiist.
Yeah, and that's why we can be spiritual naturalists and utilize these tools.
Because it's a big umbrella, and Stoicism is one of those that's under that umbrella.
About Stoicism on the you mentioned something. Oh, yeah. So that's another reason why we're talking about Stoicism today, is because it is not just some kind of thing where it's a list of beliefs about the world and therefore you're a Stoic. It's not really about that. It's about practices, practical practices that can help you to deal with life experience in a more productive and wise way, become a wiser person and a happier person, and experience more joy, not less.
And that's what was weird to me. I studied, Plato and Aristotle and all those, and they're very much about beliefs and concepts and understanding the world. And that's the impression you got by what philosophy was. But the word philosophy, simply a philosopher is simply a lover of wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you're a lover of wisdom, it's not a lover of concepts.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And if you read most philosophers today, they're talking about all these concepts and, epistemology and metaphysics and all these abstract concepts. And then you read the Stoics, it's refreshing. Philosophy can actually be something you live, not just something you think about. And that's one of the things I found interesting. To me, it went back to the spirit of Socrates. Socrates is about living the wisdom, and his big thing is the reason that the Oracle of Delphi said he was the wisest man, because he knew he didn't know.
Yes,
absolutely. It wasn't he was the smart guy. It was he realized, no, we're not smart. There's a lot we need to learn.
Yeah.
We assume we know and we don't. And to see the Stoics actually live out, in my opinion, the ideal of Socrates, of actually living wisely, not just thinking thoughts, but living wisely, I thought was fascinating.
Yes, there are some excellent. Boy, I wish I could find this really quick here so people don't have to wait. But again, in this, we'll talk about some good books for this later as we wrap up. But okay, I found it. Here is a quote from Epictetus. He says, "After you have digested these principles, show us some resulting change in the commanding faculty of your soul, just as the athletes show their shoulders as a result of their exercising and eating, and as those who have mastered the arts can show the results in their learning. The builder does not come forward and say, 'Listen to me deliver a discourse about the art of building,' but he takes a contract for a house, builds it, and thereby proves that he possesses the art." And that is what Epictetus says about our practice. Now, ironically, you can't even get to that point unless you're already talking about, giving a discourse. And it is an interesting historical thing about the effect of that and what it might have had on the history of Stoicism. But I digress. The Stoics had a very interesting structure. You mentioned Socrates. So Stoicism is considered to be one of the schools that branched out of the Socratic tradition. So you had Socrates, and then out of that, the three biggest ones were Stoicism, Epicureanism, and Skepticism. Okay, and out of those three, the Stoicism is perhaps the most developed, and that's why it gets a lot of attention like it does. Epicureanism is popular. Humanists today refer to Epicurus and Epicureanism a lot because they're talking about happiness and everything. There's a real interesting difference, though, between the Epicureans and the Stoics. Skepticism, by the way, let me cover that real quick. That's just basically an approach to knowledge, but because it didn't go much further than that, it wasn't really something you could address your whole life with. So it's not nearly as full blown as these others.
No, it was mainly an approach to questions of existence,
and very useful.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It was more of a tool. I would look at it as
There are some real specific kind of logically hair-splitting kind of things that the Stoics disagreed with the skeptics on, but for the most part, they all agreed with Socrates that you got to have reasons for what you believe. So the difference between the Stoics and the Epicureans is that Epicureans said that in order to have happiness, and by happiness we mean a wise happiness, an enlightened happiness, a flourishing was the word they used. Eudaimonia was the word that doesn't really translate well, but it kind of means a flourishing, a well-being, that kind of thing. Not, hey, I won the lottery, I'm happy, but something much more deep and enduring. Yeah. And so if we talk about this happiness, the Epicureans say that yes, you got to have all the right things going on in the makeup of your soul, your character. You got to have your good practices. You got to have your good values. You got to have virtue, what they called it. But you also have to have certain external conditions. So, I mean, you might relate that to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where, how you can have all that stuff you want, but if you're starving, so on and so forth. And that generally aligns with kind of how the modern world looks at things. The Stoics, this is going to be hard to get because it takes a lot of reading and study before you really can understand where they're coming from on this. But the Stoics said that virtue alone was both sufficient and necessary for happiness. So necessary, meaning you're not really going to have real happiness without virtue. And the impressive part is sufficient, meaning you can have it regardless of any circumstance, that it is completely within your control. And I would just point to, there's a movie about, well, okay, here's an example, a real life example. Admiral Stockdale is a person who served in the United States military and was taken prisoner during the Vietnam War, and went through great hardships and everything. And he wrote later about how Stoicism helped him to thrive amidst that. There's also a story about someone who, and this is real life too, there's someone in the concentration camps during the Holocaust.
Viktor Frankl.
There you go. Who, and I don't know anything about any connection between Viktor Frankl and Stoicism, but I'm just pointing out an example of someone who could have an inner strength and an inner
resilience,
fountain of thriving despite external circumstances. And that's the kind of thing the Stoics are talking about.
Yeah, in positive psychology, it's called resilience training.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that's based on, it's actually based partly on Stoicism.
Yeah, that's a great point. There's also cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a modern approach that got a lot from Stoicism.
Yep.
For me, it's one part of Stoicism, but I appreciate that there are other parts that I really enjoy too that it doesn't include.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, when they try to sum up Stoicism, go back to the serenity prayer, where, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.
Yes, that's a big part of the root of Stoicism.
Yeah.
And what I found when I first started learning about Stoicism was that a tiny little drop of it goes so far. It's powerful stuff.
Yeah.
And it's so powerful that it kind of made a true believer out of me. And I started investigating it further and practicing it further. There are some differences of opinion among Stoics on certain things, and just as with any tradition. And we kind of gravitate to the things that make sense to us.
Right. Yeah, that's the hard thing of getting yourself to be able to step into the shoes of somebody who lived, 200 years ago, to actually understand what they mean by what they say. Because the further the distance, the harder it is to get to contextualize within that culture, within that language, what they actually meant. And so I think a lot of times the only choice we have, unless we are scholars and rely on scholars, is to actually take those things that speak to us and put those into practice first. Because sometimes in that practice we actually begin to get a better understanding of what they meant.
And that's the thing. It's just like with Buddhism. I've told people before about that. You could read the entire Pali Canon and memorize every word of it, but you haven't even taken the first step unless you actually put it into practice.
Yeah. I doubt.
Which I guess is what Epictetus was saying.
Yeah. I doubt whether very few people have done that. That's quite a. I have the Pali Canon, so English translations of pretty much the entire Pali Canon, and I haven't read everything in there, so let alone memorized it. So it's some thick reading, and it really isn't about that. It's Buddhism, Stoicism, they both emphasize the same thing: do it. then you'll understand it.
Yes.
Don't sit there and read the manual about the car. Look at the car, get in, take the car for a drive. That's the way you're going to know how it works, how it feels, how it drives, whether it really is the car for you.
There's a lot of naturalists who, because we tend to be people who really like reason, rationality, the scientific approach, and those are all great things. They are an integrated part of our practice and our worldview. But when you kind of come up as that kind of person in the modern world today, you tend to want to approach things in this manner. You tend to say, okay, first I'm going to analyze everything. I'm going to read it. I'm going to analyze it. I'm going to think about it, maybe discuss it, figure it out. Once I got it all figured out, then I can decide which things are the right way to go, and then I'll do it. But the problem with that approach is that when it comes to these kinds of spiritual practices is that they are experiential, and they specifically work on and refer to something which is a subjective experience. So there's no real way to investigate them without doing it firsthand. I mean, it'd be different if you were saying, okay, we're going to measure how many people say they feel better or that their life is better after meditating. And you can measure that in an empirical, traditional, third-person perspective, scientific way. But if you really want to know for you, what is it like from a first-person perspective, you have to do it. And that is the way it's investigated. That's the way you investigate a subjective, a practice designed to mold the subjective experience.
And for me, I like to, balance the two things. For an example, I'm not going to go someplace and do a seance, for an example. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I
if
like
it's based
to think,
on something that
I think I think the balance is we need to have a spirituality within the bounds of science, is how I like to say it. Science sets the framework. It's okay to play with that framework. It's not solid, but there are some things that are solid. Pretty much, we're pretty sure that the universe around us exists pretty much how it is. It's called realism. Basically what we see is. But when you start getting into practices, you don't know how a practice is actually going to affect you, and the difference it's going to make in your life until you do it. And when we're talking about practice, we're talking about naturalistic practices that don't involve supernatural entities.
That's correct.
We're dealing with natural. We're living a natural world. There's practices to help us connect with the natural world, to connect with our mind, to better live a more fulfilling and happy life. And those things, the only way you're going to know whether those practices work or not is to do them.
Yeah.
You have to do them. And
if somebody came to me and said, "Oh, if you do this meditation, you'll levitate," I'm very skeptical of that because that violates a lot of what I know about physics.
Right, exactly.
And so I'd be very skeptical approaching it, very doubtful, I should say, approaching it. But if somebody says something and it kind of jives with what we know about brain plasticity and the ability of new neuron connections to form based on neural activity and things like that, that seems to make more sense. And I'm still, even in those cases, we should approach it skeptically as long as we understand that skepticism doesn't mean denial. It means investigating and then either affirming or not affirming based on what you find.
But the difference between those two things is one is skeptical, no thank you, I'll pass, and the other is skeptical, let me give it a try. Mm-hmm. Let me test drive it, see if this actually does make a difference in my life.
There's definitely an element of doing it. You have to do it. And that's what we have in both Stoicism and Buddhism.
Exactly. Yep.
So also in that is the difference between knowledge and real knowledge, or
wisdom,
intellectual knowledge and
I call it insight or wisdom.
Yeah, insight, wisdom.
I mean, you can read books till you're blue in the face. That's just going to give you intellectual knowledge. It's where the rubber meets the road in actual practice that you get the wisdom. It's doing it, failing, picking up yourself, doing something else. It's actually in the failures that you get the wisdom. There's no other way. The more failures you have, the wiser you're going to get if you learn from those.
So I'd like to propose something. How about I kind of briefly go over the structure of Stoicism, how it's structured, its general structure, and then we can talk about some specific ideas and practices. Well, first I'd like to talk about some specific powerful concepts and perspectives of Stoicism, and then specific practices of Stoicism. On the structure, Stoicism is designed to be a philosophy for living well. It addresses that question of Socrates: what is the best way to live, or
the good life?
How do we have a good life? Both senses of the word. And so, as such, everything in Stoicism is interconnected, and there's three interconnected sections. There's Stoic physics, Stoic logic, and Stoic ethics. I like to boil that down to say what is, what ought to be, and how do we know? And that is essentially what early philosophy was originally. Anytime you're asking what is, what ought to be, or how do we know, you're doing philosophy, which later specialized out into the sciences and the ethics and all that. So Stoic, you could really arbitrarily start anywhere in this because they're all very chicken and the egg kind of interconnected. But Stoic physics, by physics back then they meant the natural sciences, basically what their idea of the world was. Now in this area you're going to find some really out there ideas, and they're very generalized, and they're quite off base from modern cosmology, modern physics, modern understanding. But there's this thing I like to call the useful correlates to modern understanding. And so there were a lot of different early ideas about how the world works, but the Stoics happen to be on base about some specific parts of that in a way that still works even after you replace modern physics. So, for example, okay, let me start with this. Not all that is real exists. So normally we think of what is real and what exists as the same thing. For the Stoics, there's that which is real, and then there's that which exists. Okay, first let's think of a super category, the real. And then within that, there's two subcategories, those things which exist and those things which subsist. And the Stoics were some of the earliest materialists. So the corporeal, the material bodies, as they called them, were things that exist. And then there were things that subsist, meaning they subsist on the relationships, interrelationships, and the dispositions of the things that exist. And so today we might call that an emergent property.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking.
Yeah, and this is very similar to when you get behind the words and get into the details, it's very similar to the Buddhist concept of emptiness. The Buddhists aren't saying that there's no reality or that what we see around us isn't real. What they're saying is that the nature of it is different than we think it is. And the things that we give labels to are kind of our labels that in lines around things that we divide up in the way that makes sense for us, but it's not necessarily reality. Another big concept of the Stoics was the logos. And the logos, it translates roughly as word or reason. And today I would think that a good translation might be the laws of physics. But even that's kind of a little too bare-boned, because it means the the order by which things happen. If you were going to list it out or whatever, it's the ultimate, reasoning, or I should say, the rational structure of the universe. The fact that the universe works in a rational way according to natural law. Things don't just happen. It's not random. It's not capricious. It's not based on the free will of some entity. It's all according to natural law. And as such, the Stoics were pretty much determinists. And so it is an account of how things work. The divine animating principle pervading the universe, the way of nature. Now, the thing that they called Zeus, and this gets to what you said about the way language has changed over the years and how when you look back at it, one of the things that's happened with a lot of the words used in Stoic writing, when you start reading Stoic writings and you see words like Zeus or God or soul, you got to realize that these words have been Christianized between the time of then and the time of now. And when you actually, like, you can go back to Socrates, and you could read in Socrates, I think it's Euthyphro is the book, and he's talking about the nature of the soul. Well, if you follow that conversation, it's very obvious that they're talking about the mind, the personhood, whatever that is. They didn't understand the workings of the brain, but whatever that thing is that's personhood. So you would never have an argument over whether souls exist, because the soul is that thing which is the essence of a person, whatever its nature, right? So it of course it exists, but it's just what is the nature of it. And so this is the context in which they speak of soul. Then later the Christians said, well, here's what a soul is. It's this ghosty thing that goes to heaven when you die, So now today we think of that as soul, but so you kind of have to unlearn what you've learned to really get behind these concepts. So what's interesting about their take on Zeus is that it's exactly like their take on the soul. They believed that Zeus was the soul of the universe. Now, they also believed that material bodies were the only thing that exists, and everything else that's real are the things that subsist as interrelationships between those material bodies. Even Zeus was, they had this belief that at the end of the time the universe would end in a fiery conflagration, and that's the way the universe began, and then it would start all over again. I don't know where they got that from, but whatever. Actually, for whatever reason.
Interestingly enough, that's one of the things in the Pali Canon. It talks about the eons and how it goes through the cycles of beginning, an expansion and a contraction, and it continues. Mm-hmm. That's the Buddhist teaching. That's expands and contracts nonstop. There is no beginning in Buddhist cosmology.
Yeah, that's interesting. So that's exactly what the Stoic cosmology is.
It's interesting.
Yeah. And they believed that even Zeus would be destroyed in this conflagration and reborn. So Zeus was a part of nature, and it's not even a separate part. It is, in fact, nature. And so when they say Zeus is the soul of the universe, what they mean is Zeus is the essence of how the universe works. And so we're getting into kind of abstract forms. Right. But when you think of the essence of how I work, that's my soul. And so the soul of the universe and the soul of me, or the soul of whatever, they're all kind of like the same. They're saying the same thing. And so, again, it's not a question of whether there is a nature to the universe.
Yeah.
There is. The question is, what is its nature?
So would Zeus be personalized or unpersonal? Would it be impersonal?
Usually with the Stoics, it was a much less personified form of the deity. But there were debates between the early Stoics, the middle Stoics, and the late Stoics, and there's debates online today between the Stoics online.
Okay.
And
so the debate has not ended.
Yeah, we're still waiting for the results on that one. But there are different interpretations of exactly how personified you get with it. But here's my point about the personification. If we're naturalists and we think about, we personify ourselves, for example, but yet most naturalists understand that everything that goes on in our brains is going on because of physics. It's all, and all the particles in there, there's no magic particles in there. All the particles in there are the same kind of particles that make up matter outside of our skull. And it's all integrated. It's all causally connected, right? Inside and outside. It's all the same. It's all part of the universe. It's all flowing according to natural law.
All part of nature.
And so if that's the case, what are you really talking about then when you talk about a person? There is obviously some kind of thing that subsists that is a person, but it's not like a stone that you hold in your hand.
Right, and I think that's exactly Buddhist's point about no self.
Mm-hmm.
It's
exactly.
It's not something that you can hold in your hand. It's an ever-flowing convergence of in Buddhism, it's the five aggregates. It's yes. These aggregates that come together, flow. It's kind of like a wave. A wave isn't a thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's an event.
You see the wave move from left to right, but what is moved from left to right? Nothing.
Yep.
It's the same
so
exact.
We're an event, is what is the Buddhist interpretation. We're an event.
Yes. And so when you start to think about the human soul in that sense, what are you really saying about the universe's soul?
Yeah.
It's the same thing. The question I would answer is saying God is as real as you or I. The question is, are we real? Do we exist? So it all kind of like becomes one sort of thing. But the key thing is that the logos is the order by which things happen. If we understand that and we try to live in accord with the nature of reality, then we will be wiser.
And this, to me, it sounds a lot like the Tao in Taoism.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Where the Tao and the Tao Te Ching talks about the Tao of Tian is the Chinese word. It means, it's usually translated heaven, but in Zhuangzi it's actually translated nature by some translators. So it's the Tao of nature. So it's the way of nature, which gives a much deeper understanding of how, it's kind of sounds a little similar, between the Zeus of nature and the Tao of nature. There's some similarities there, I think, where a lot of times we're groping for terminology to express our understanding and our experience of reality. And it's sometimes hard to do that. And you're dealing with two completely different cultures and languages. So how much, actually correlates between the Tao and Zeus, I don't know. But it's an interesting thing, because when Taoism first came to the United States, it came through missionaries who actually would translate, some of them would translate Tao as God.
Yeah, because it's what we understood. It's what the natives understood.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. And so that kind of thing goes on all the time. And, certainly even at that time, there were people out in the street that could have gone outside their academy and talked to them about Zeus, and they would have pictured some guy with a big gray curly beard.
Yeah.
So it's the same stuff that goes on today.
It does. Yep. Terminology to me is one of the biggest hurdles we struggle with, and we get hung up on. And we need to get past the terms and have the experience, and then we can go back and the terms make more sense.
Yes, you start to go, and then you read the same line that you've been reading for years, but now you really understand it.
Yep. And
you thought you understood it before. And one person in a discussion group I was talking to one time on this said, it's kind of like a circle. And I said, well, it's kind of like a spiral, really, because you come back around to the same point, but now you're
at a different place.
You've learned more, and now it's different to you. And then you come back around to it again and again,
exactly.
and it just unfolds and unfolds, and you get deeper and deeper understandings of what they're saying.
Exactly. And that's, I think, the biggest difficulty I have when I talk to people from different traditions is they haven't gone deep enough into their tradition.
Mm.
They've got a surface level understanding of Christianity or whatever it is. And I always say, whatever tradition you're in, go deeper.
Yeah. Sometimes it takes being outside the tradition to appreciate it as much. Sometimes when you grow up in something, you have all of this baggage that's clouding your appreciation from, you know what I mean? It's kind of biasing you.
Yep.
Okay, so the second thing they had was Stoic Logic. And logic was just basically, it's like kind of what you think of as logic today, as syllogisms and things like that.
Aristotle is what I usually think of. Aristotle.
Sorry?
I usually think of Aristotle,
yes.
The law of identity, law of excluded middle, and law of non-contradiction.
It's that kind of thing. Yeah. Well, if you get into Stoic Logic and you start reading about it, you find out that it actually rivaled Aristotle in their accomplishments in the field of logic, but it wasn't appreciated until the 20th century after some discoveries. And there are certain advances that they made over Aristotelian logic. They built upon Megarian logic, and there was a bunch of other stuff. That's not something we really need to get into too much today, because
that's got a technical.
Got all kinds of logic and everything.
Yeah.
But that was a big part of their thing. I think I'll just move on to Stoic ethics, because that's really the meat of what we're going to get out of Stoicism, really. And Stoic ethics covers more than just, okay, here's your rules for living, your 10 commandments. It's not that at all. Ethics is basically talking about virtue, and virtue is talking about what are those traits that if you have them, you're living in accord with the nature of a moral, rational being. And that's a very loaded sentence.
Yeah.
But so moral, rational being. Okay, so it starts with an understanding of what we are. What are we? And moral, rational being, it doesn't mean that we act morally all the time, and it doesn't mean that we act rationally all the time. Very often we're immoral, and very often we're irrational. But we're moral, rational beings in the sense that we are beings who are capable of this. This is a capacity that human beings have. And by rational, that's pretty straightforward. We can understand things, we can make predictions, we can comprehend things, and we can reason out things and understand. So that part's easy. Moral, in this sense, means something very specific. It means the ability to take that understanding and modulate our behavior in accord to it. So we're not just impulsively reacting to whatever, I like to joke that if dogs had restaurants, it wouldn't work, because everybody would just rush in and jump over the counter and go to the back where the kitchen is and rip out the meat and eat it off the floor, and you couldn't have a restaurant. So, that's what that means. It means we have the capacity to work together in a cooperative way and to modulate our behavior. Now, what that also means in more modern way of phrasing is that we're social animals. So we have a certain nature to our psychology. We feel guilty when we hurt others, or we will experience other kinds of emotional, psychological impacts from being a certain kind of person or doing certain kinds of things as opposed to others. Or we greatly gain fulfillment by being compassionate and having a loving life, that kind of thing. So that's what it means to live in accord with your nature as a moral, rational being. And so those things, those character traits that are naturally lead to the flourishing good life. And their absence or their opposite, viciousness, as in vice, lead to unhappiness, naturally.
And I always thought that one of the ways to look at this, too, is the difference between the commandment-centered morality and the virtue-centered morality. The command-centered actually requires effort. Mm-hmm. You have a rule, and you have to consciously not break that rule. Where virtue-centered, you're putting the virtues inside you. So you're not following a rule, you're following your second nature. You're installing these programs in you so that when an event comes up, the program kicks in and you act honestly. For an example, the virtue of honesty comes out, or the virtue of faithfulness, that comes out. So you're actually pre-programming yourself to respond in different situations by your character rather than following a rule, which then doesn't require as much effort. Because if you really want to do something and you have a rule saying don't do it, how successful is that really going to be? Yeah. And unfortunately, that's what a lot of people do, is they try to live by that rule-based thing, and they end up breaking the rule all the time because they haven't put in the effort to build the character that will reprogram their mind to respond in that virtuous way.
That's why all the hotel owners say when the Baptist convention is in town, all of their porn subscriptions in the rooms goes way up. So, it's like I want to make this comic that basically shows Neo in the Matrix, and he's talking to Morpheus, and he says, "Wait a minute, are you telling me if I learn Stoicism that I'll be able to control my emotions?" And then Morpheus says, "No, I'm saying when you're ready, you won't have to."
Nice.
And so that's basically it. I mean, I tell people, if you're trying to control your emotions, you've already missed something in the Stoic endeavor. You're already going astray. So
even from a Buddhist perspective, with emotions, you don't try to control your emotions. What you try to do is let go of them. It's the very controlling that makes the emotion go out of control.
And that act of you're stepping outside yourself and looking at yourself makes the power of it go away.
And really, usually we say we have two responses, fight or flight. Buddhism offers a third, observe. Step back and observe. You don't have to fight or flight. You can actually step back and observe. And once you become that third person observer, it's like you've taken the oxygen out of the fire slowly dwindles and dies.
Now it's the adult making the decisions, correct, not the child.
Yep.
And the adult may decide that they need to fight or flee or whatever, but it's being made in a more controlled way.
Correct. With wisdom.
Not controlled, but more...
with wisdom. With wisdom.
Yes, yes. And so... That's where Stoicism begins, this understanding our nature, right? And with that understanding, what you understand is that anytime you do vice, anytime you're vicious, anytime you act with hate, greed, all these kind of things, you're harming yourself.
Right.
I think it was Chrysippus who talked about, I may be wrong about this, but I think it was Chrysippus who talked about the nature of character and how that, and he gave an analogy to help understand. He says it's like a cylinder. Yes, certain things happen to you and you react to them. So imagine the cylinder rolling down a ramp. Well, as you mold your character, you shape the cylinder to be bumpy or smooth or larger or smaller or whatever, and that will affect how it rolls down the ramp. So when the time comes, it's like people say, "Oh, that person made me so mad." And then to them, it seems like that's just an automatic reaction. This person did this thing and they made me mad.
Right.
And to them, it feels like there's nothing they could have done. Of course you get mad. That's just a natural response. But the thing you do isn't by pretending you're not mad or bottling it up or trying to act like you're not mad and, "Oh, look how stoic I am." That's not how you do it. The way you do it is by engaging in practices, which we'll get to in a moment, that over time change your perspective of the situation in such a way where the anger doesn't naturally emerge to begin with. Correct. There's nothing to constrain. And you'll notice little changes before you notice big ones that lead you on and on and on and encourage you.
Right. And that's the same with any kind of practice. You'll begin to see the little changes, like mindfulness meditation. You'll notice that you're being more mindful of something. And in the Stoic practices, you'll notice that you're not so reactive. You're still reactive, but it's not the fire isn't quite as raring as it used to be. It's just a little bit less, because you're beginning to look at it from a different perspective, from a wider angle, and the practices are actually beginning to, because virtue is not a thing you turn on or off. It's like a plant that you grow. You have to water it. And as it grows, it gets stronger. And as it gets stronger, it begins to manifest more and more in your life. And so it's a time investment in virtues. And virtues is something it's cross, any religion will teach you that virtues is important.
Yeah. And it's all about how those neurons work.
Yep.
You just keep plowing that field, and it gets deeper and deeper and deeper.
Yep.
So what are these perspectives that Stoics have that so free us? I think it's worth talking about two really core concepts here, and these are two of the drops that I was referring to earlier that are real powerful. The first, I don't even know that they really have names. It's just a thing that I noticed in Stoicism, and so I give it a name so I can talk about it. One I call the judgment doctrine, and the other one I call the control doctrine. So judgment is their take on judgment. So when I said before, things happen and people say, oh, that person made me so mad, what they're not seeing there, they're thinking stimulus response. Data in, data out, Person slaps me, I get angry.
Right.
But what the Stoics realized is that there's a thing in between the stimulus and the response, which is a judgment.
Yep.
There's the stimulus, it happens, then your brain has to judge it and say, this is a bad thing, and the appropriate response is anger. And then the anger is triggered, the emotional anger is triggered, because you believed not only that this was a big wrong done to you, that you've somehow been harmed by this, and they get real specific into the definition of what is true harm and what isn't true harm. But that the appropriate response is inner turmoil. And so that's why they say that all suffering arises from false judgments. It's just that we are unconscious of these judgments. They happen in a microsecond, and they're so deeply instilled that we take them for granted. We don't even see them at first.
It reminds me of a story I heard that illustrates this perfectly. You're in a grocery store. All of a sudden you get bumped from behind. You turn around, you're all pissed, and you see that it's someone who's blind. Your upsetness instantly disappears because they're blind. Mm-hmm. It was a judgment that someone pushed me. And that judgment went away when they realized it was unintentional. The anger was completely, from beginning to end, completely determined upon the judgment, not upon the event.
Uh-huh.
Whether someone had pushed you or a blind person bumped into you, the event was the same. The response was different only because of the judgment.
Yes. That's like Epictetus said, it's not the things that harm us, it's our judgment of the things. And in fact, your story of the person in line bumping, it is almost exactly the same as a story in Buddhism that talks about a person in a boat in the fog, and then another boat comes and hits their boat, and they're angry until they notice that there's no one in the boat. And it was just moving along. Then they're not angry because there wasn't a person there. Now, what's interesting about that version of the story is this highlights the interconnectedness between Stoic ethics and back to Stoic physics, because as we discussed before, there is no one in the boat.
Right. And
everything that happens, every person that does something to you, every decision they make is because of prior causes. So the Buddhists call it dependent origination. It's all happening because of the will of Zeus, of the unfolding of the logos, of the laws of nature, and unfolding the only way they could unfold. Once you start having those kinds of perspectives, you don't get quite so hung up in the peculiar nastinesses of people.
Right.
You maturely expect it and understand that that's a thing out there in the world. You're not surprised when you run into it. So That's what the judgment thing is about. It's about recognizing first that that's in there, that there is that moment of judgment, and then opening it up and saying, what judgments did I make there, and how were they wrong? And as you start to examine that, and you make a practice of examining that through maybe journaling or reading, discussions, you make these a part of your practice. Daily journaling about what you did, where you faltered, and where you did good, and what you're going to try to do tomorrow in your practice. Those kinds of conscious, mindful examination of your own life and how you're living it. As you go through those things, it starts to change your ideas about things, and that gets deeper and deeper. And as that gets deeper and deeper, that little judgment nexus, instead of just reacting immediately, it'll get conflicting signals, and it won't know what to do, and it'll stop you, and you'll have a moment there in between the stimulus and the response, and eventually you'll notice some times where it's like, man, I used to get really mad when that would happen, and I didn't this time. The next element that we should really mention when we talk about Stoicism is their take on control. And this gets to what you said earlier about the Serenity Prayer. The Serenity Prayer came out of the Christian tradition much later than the Bible, I think. But it's based on concepts in the Bible. And early Christianity was heavily influenced by Stoicism, which just preceded it, and was also very big at the time Christianity rose. So there's a lot of early Stoic ideas that made their way into some of the wisest parts of the Bible, as it would happen. And so this thing about control, the wisdom to know what I control and what I don't, but it's important to understand what they mean by control, because the way most people think about control today is this idea of degrees of control. They think, well, I have a lot of control over this, over, whether I'm going to go exercise today, but I have a little bit of control over whether I get that promotion because I can try to work hard, but somebody may betray me or whatever. And then I have very little control over what happens in the Middle East. And, they have this idea of this spectrum.
Graduation, graduate level of control.
The Stoics said that was a very unhelpful way to look at it. And after thinking about it some more and reading more about it and considering, I kind of came to the same conclusion that it's really not that helpful to think about it in those terms, because I like to use the example of, let's say you get a promotion, you work in this office and you get a promotion and they say, you're the head administrator now. And you get the corner office and you're like, oh, this is great. Now I'm going to do things the way they should be done. And you start putting out memos on how things are supposed to be and how you make changes. And before too long, you get a letter from upstairs. And the chief head administrator, who works on the floor above you, sent you a memo saying, hey, on that last memo you sent out, we need you to change that. We can't really do it that way because of blah, 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 so you got to change it. So you go, okay, and you change it. And you go on, and then you realize this happens a few times, and then you realize, wait a minute, if I were to make 2 columns here of things that I agree with and things that the head administrator agrees with, and I put check marks, and then I look at what actually happens, what I find is that the only time the thing happens is when I happen to agree with the chief head administrator.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so I really have any control?
How much choice do you really have? Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so the universe is kind of like that. We put inputs into the system, but I mean, it doesn't matter how big your army is, how mighty a leader you are, a peanut going down the wrong hole ends it all. And it's more powerful than all those tanks and planes and everything. It got in past your guards. It's it. You get a spontaneous thing happen in the brain, and that's it. So, yes, it's good to make your plans and try to do your stuff and all, but you have to realize that ultimately you are not in control of any of that stuff. You could work out, do all the right things, and then your heart does something weird, and that's it.
So what did they what did they actually say that we have control of then? So because from what I'm understanding, you're saying that there's not a scale. It's either a direct control or let go.
Yes. The only thing that we control, and they call all of these things externals.
Right.
The only thing that we control is the will, our choice, our very nexus of will. Now, sometimes people lose that too, like when they get, if they get Alzheimer's and things like that, or
brain
injuries, things like that. Yes, but assuming you have a normally functioning human being who can appreciate and take in and practice Stoicism, then the thing that you control is your will. And that means that you control your choices, your values, your actions. But even then, they got way down to the nitty gritty. There's like,
right,
if I'm
because even
pick
that's
up
limited.
Cup,
even that's limited.
Yes, if I'm going to pick up a cup of tea, the only thing I controlled was the choice to pick up the cup of tea. After that signal left my brain, it's now up to the logos. It's physics. So a signal moving down the arm and grabbing the tea, and the tea spilled. So there's always a possibility of a spasm. There's always things that can interfere with that. So with this very, very strict idea of control, what the Stoics set out to do is to say, here is a path to happiness over which you have complete control. And that's their big gripe with the Epicureans. Epicureans who said you have to have these external circumstances to have happiness means that your happiness is not within your control. And so by the Stoics' reckoning, your happiness is completely within your control. And by happiness, of course, we mean that deeper flourishing. And so when you understand what is in your control and what is not, then you start to say, okay, well, what are the choices? What are those choices which are going to lead to happiness and those which are not? And that's when you get back to virtue, when you get back to living in accord with nature, living in accord, which includes, that's capital N, nature, which includes the nature of everything, the nature of your world, the nature of how the world works, the nature of yourself as a moral, rational being, all of those things. And when all of that is taken into account, what you'll find is something that's very much along the lines of what most people think of when they think of virtue. And so by understanding that control thing, that is so powerful that when things happen and you realize it's not within my control, then it's kind of like how, and this is an element in Christianity that's picked that up, where they say it's in God's hands. Now, you don't want to use that as some kind of like escape from responsibility. Right, a cop-out. But it can be a way of saying, I don't have to manage the whole universe. I don't have to worry and aggravate and anxiety over all these things. I handle my little part, and the rest is a matter for the logos.
Right. And I think that goes back to the whole idea within Buddhism of accepting reality as it is. It is what it is. Yes. It's not going to change just because you don't want it to be that way. So your choice is to try to continue to fight against what is unchangeable, or just accept it and do what you can do. Yes. You can only do what you can do, so worry about that and leave the rest to whatever you want to call it, fate, Zeus, Dow. Yeah.
And mindfulness is so important in this practice. That's why Buddhist meditation has been helpful to me as a Stoic, because when you use meditation to increase your focus, your attention, your mindfulness of your own inner workings, then you start to see what's going on in your head, and you're spotting the misjudgments. And that starts to have a formative effect.
Yep.
And it starts to give you this bigger perspective, and it starts to shift your nucleus of self outside of your own mind and up to a more cosmic perspective. And when you do that, you free yourself to a great extent. Yeah.
So you got some books to recommend for people who are interested in?
So for the most introductory level, I've got a couple of books here. The first one is The Spiritual Teachings of Marcus Aurelius by Mark Forstater. Forstater, it could be.
Is that a relatively new translation then?
Yes, this is
Good.
totally new. Forstater is his last name, and I won't say totally new. I mean, it's very new in the scope of Stoic history.
Yeah.
It's a modern, recent book, but
Yeah.
it's
Well, I read the public domain version of it, and it's the language is a little bit archaic in the I forget who the translator is. So
yeah. This particular book came out in the year 2000, but this is not Marcus Aurelius's Meditations.
Oh, okay.
I would not advise somebody to jump right into that
No,
because
that's difficult.
you're going to be lost.
Yeah.
There's a lot of Stoic terminology that we didn't get in here today. So this is a very natural language kind of book. It just tells you, kind of like how we've been talking today. But this is one of the first ones I read that really got me into the wisdom of Marcus Aurelius, because it takes it all and it sections it into different principles. Yep. It draws out the quotes and makes it where, you can see what he's saying here now. And in fact, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations was not even meant for publication. He wanted it to be destroyed.
Yeah, wasn't that his own meditation journal?
When we talk about journaling, that's what he was doing. It was his own journal to himself. And in fact, it shows that Marcus Aurelius was by no means a sage. A sage is considered the perfect example of Stoicism, which hypothetically serves as an arrow, a way for us to think about what we're trying to do. And he had to remind himself of things all the time, and that was part of his practice, remind himself of principles and things that happened in that day. But it also happens to teach us a great deal about Stoicism, when you're ready for that. So this book, though, there's a section on living in the world, cultivating the self, the inner spirit, the universal mind, contemplating death, everything changes, at one with nature, peace is in your hands. These are what he's named these sections where he's gathered together these quotes, which are in the actual book are all just run together in whatever order. And also he's translated them in a very easy to read way.
Good.
But the best part of the book is that at the beginning he talks about philosophy and what real philosophy is for and how it's supposed to be practiced as a way of life, and really, really cool stuff.
Cool.
The other introductory book is the one that you and I were talking about earlier that you all like, which is A Guide to the Good Life, The Ancient Art of Stoic Joy, by William B. Irvine, Irvine. A lot of Stoic experts take some difficulty with some of the things he says in here, so it's not perfect. He talks a lot in this book about negative visualization as a practice, and I think I tend to consider that kind of an advanced practice. I wouldn't recommend people do that right off the bat. It could actually, if it's not done right and you're not ready for it, could cause problems. Yeah. But there is a lot of good stuff in this book, and it really gives you a sense of, kind of what Stoicism is about.
Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed that. That's actually was my first book.
Yeah, and it makes a great first book. It's real easy to read. It's good introduction. The thing that I would really, if you really like this and you read some of this stuff already, and if you read some things online maybe, and you're ready for really the nitty-gritty, but not necessarily ancient terminologies and stuff like that, then what I'd recommend is, this is the main book I'd recommend. It's just simply called Stoicism, and it's by John Sellars, Sellars. And this book is what I was reading from earlier when I was reading some of the dates and people who got it started. But this book goes through, it gives you what happened when as far as the history. It goes through each of the formative figures, Chrysippus, Aristo, Cleanthes, all these different Stoics and what they contributed and all that. But that's just the history part. That's just the beginning. After that, it does go into Stoic physics, logic, and ethics in a much more complete way. But it's not hard to read. It's easy to read, and it's I've gone through it and I've marked it up with all kinds of notes. It's the New Stoa is an organization, newstoa.org. You can go to their site. It might be New. Yeah, and the New Stoa is an organization. I'm a board member, and they promote Stoicism and help build Stoic community. We have a course of theirs listed on the Spiritual Naturalist Society's courses page, which they called their Stoic Extended Studies course, and this is the textbook for it. So you could take that course, which is really helpful, or you could just read the book too. That's a good one. I have two other books here. One is Tom Morris, who wrote The Stoic Art of Living, Inner Resilience and Outer Results. That's got some good stuff in it. It's also kind of introductory. It's probably more introductory than the Stoicism book. And then the last one I have is if you really feel like you're ready to take on a lot more technical kind of, you want to get into the history of these, you want to look at the original sources and understand them better and all that, then A.A. Long and D.N. Sedley, their work, The Hellenistic Philosophers, Volume 1, contains the best, some of the most authoritative translations and talking about explaining Stoic ideas and their origins and everything. After you do that, you can go ahead and, even before that point, you can start hitting up Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius, and you'll understand what they're talking about. But the main thing, though, like we said before, is just doing it. And some of the key practices are the journaling we talked about. Meditation certainly helps, mindfulness meditation. And when you read these principles of Stoicism, just going over them in their head, examining your own life, examining what you did today, how you acted, how you felt, acknowledging it. Don't pretend you're a sage when you're not. Just acknowledge where you are. You're what's called we all are what's called a Procopton, which is the learner of Stoicism. But those words aren't really important. What's important is the ideas.
Right.
So how do you feel, Jay, since you're getting into this and everything? I know you're coming at it from Buddhism. I kind of came at Stoicism first and then learned Buddhism, which is interesting. We both, yeah.
And we met in the middle. That's the great thing. Yeah, Stoicism to me, with both Buddhism and Taoism being both kind of my major studies, what I found interesting was actually the things that Stoicism adds that neither of those traditions have, such as the negative visualization. I actually found that interesting because, having gone through, the mindfulness meditation, and so, I know one of the things you do with that is taking a time. Negative visualization, just real quickly, is basically picturing and visualizing losing everything, kind of being like Job in the Bible. Mm-hmm. Because we take so much for granted in our lives. The problem with that is you get an emotion of just complete emptiness if you really do the visualization correctly, and which can be very traumatic if you're not prepared for it. And that's why, you suggested an advanced practice, and I would agree with that. The other part that they do, though, is actually taking a day and just turn off all the phones, leave the lights out, for an example. Just one day or even 2 days or something of just complete deprivation of things that you take for granted. You realize, wow, just imagine for some people, going a whole day with no computer, no cell phone, no TV, no electronic input at all, and how dramatic that would be for some people. And then
except without computer, how would they get on Facebook?
Exactly. It would be traumatic.
It's exploring your boundaries and understanding yourself, and then beginning to take the reins of yourself.
And Buddhism doesn't actually have a practice similar to that. I mean, you can go on retreat, but the idea is meditation. It's not just the absence of things. But to actually take a minute to focus on the absence of things, not while you're trying to distract yourself with meditation or walking meditation or chanting or mantras or something. No, just realize and really feel the emotion of that emptiness, of that being gone. It's like one of the things I've been doing is I get so used to listening to radio. I have a commute about 35 minutes to get to work, and I listen to the radio there and back. Usually NPR, to get the latest news, and I like to listen to classical music when I'm, going to work. And so I've had problems with my vehicle, so I actually have it off to try to make sure it doesn't drain the battery. And it was kind of interesting. I didn't think it would bother me, but I see myself, my finger wants to move to turn it on. And I never realized that before. It was just something that was so automatic that you become unaware of it. Even with practicing mindfulness, sometimes you're not mindful of something unless it's absence. The absence actually makes you aware, oh, wait a second, I was actually attached to that more than I thought I was. And that's where I think the wisdom of actually some of these practices, in addition to, because Buddhism has acceptance in it. It has the idea of accepting reality. It has the acceptance of letting things, emotions be. Like you said, there's a lot of similarities, but there are some differences. And if someone is really involved in Buddhism, there's some practice in Stoicism that actually might help advance them in their own practice to become more mindful of their attachments.
I think that's great. Very well said. And there's things that you can find in almost all of these things on the other side, but it's just a question of how much is it emphasized and how much of it is really developed well.
Right.
And it's just different areas and different for each one. But you combine them together, it also makes a really good introduction for a Westerner to Buddhist ideas.
Yeah.
If I had gone directly to Buddhism, you jumped a wide chasm very well. But if I'd gone directly to Buddhism before coming to understand Stoicism better, I would have found it much more difficult to grasp a lot of the more profound concepts in Buddhism.
But in all fairness, my transition actually was from evangelical Christian, and then I got into the mystics, and then from the mystics, I made the leap to Gnosticism and then to the Christian mystics
start to get into kind of a Buddhistic kind of thing. Yeah, so that's great. Yep. Well, I feel like we've covered a pretty good amount. I think our listeners probably are gonna, if they like this, then they've gotten a pretty good introduction to it and can go on with those other materials that they like. And if you the listener would like to leave us comments on our webpage. We have a different webpage for each episode, and you can leave comments specific to that episode. Just go to spiritualnaturalistsociety.org and drop us a line. Let us know how we're doing, what you think. If you have any questions or comments, we'll be glad to hear from you.
Definitely.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Jay.
Well, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed, and I could tell your excitement about Stoicism, so it was great. I love it.
I'm all emotional about it.
Yeah. Now, if that's not an oxymoron.
Yeah. Okay, well, everybody take care until next time. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
This program was sponsored by the Spiritual Naturalist Society. Learn more and become a member at spiritualnaturalistsociety.org. Our music was composed by John Clemisrude. Jay Forrest is our technical director. Please share our program and join us next time on Spiritual Naturalism Today.